Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, April 24th, 2025. We acknowledge that today is Yom Ha-Zikaron La-Shoah the Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust and Heroism, Yom Ha-Shoah in short. And we have, before the recording began, stood at attention in silence for a minute of remembrance of the 6 million of our people and the 5 million other of God's children who were murdered by the terrorist Nazi regime in World War II. We bless as we prepare to continue our study of marriage and divorce in the Jewish tradition, which is the subject of our spring learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Last week, we began our foray into the study of marriage and divorce, looking at some biblical texts that establish what I refer to as biblical norms, not of marriage, but of coupling. And the key takeaway that I can now reframe for us is that the Bible does not establish a norm of marriage, although it does presuppose that there are units of coupling between husbands and wives, often in the Bible, one husband and multiple wives. So polygamy is endorsed implicitly, if not explicitly, throughout the Tanakh. That at the very least allow us to speak idiomatically about married couples, even though there is no word for to marry in the biblical tradition. Um, However, when we get to rabbinic law, we have to internalize the understanding that this comes centuries and centuries after the Hebrew Bible has been a finished work, and that in the rabbinic period, the rabbis actually sought to establish norms of family life, especially around the institution of marriage, that would authorize couples as married couples and therefore would allow new families to be welcomed within the Jewish community, as well as establish clear guidelines for inheritance. And you see in the Bible, like just even a cursory study of the book of Genesis makes clear that lack of clarity around inheritance creates problems in families. Like just read the story of, oh, I don't know, Cain and Abel, and Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael and Yitzchak, and then Isaac and Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob and all of his sons. Like there's real issues with the established norm. There's that word again, if you were paying attention before we started our recording this morning, to norms versus laws. There is an established norm in the Bible of primogeniture, meaning that the eldest son would be the heir that gets challenged or even upended generation after generation. That's really the through line of the book of Genesis, is that the younger inherits against the norm of the time, which was that the oldest is supposed to be the dominant son. This, as well as, I think, an intention to protect women, especially from being summarily cast out by their husbands. We've heard of certain world traditions where a husband can just get rid of an unwanted wife through the simple recitation of, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, or what have you. That is made improbable, if not impossible, through the innovations of rabbinic law. And that's what we began to study last week by looking at Tractate Kiddushin in the Babylonian Talmud, page 2a, which is where we're going to pick up. We're just going to do another paragraph or so of that tractate. And then we're going to bop around a little bit to look at some other norms of marriage in the Jewish tradition. So just as a little recap of where we were last week, and of course, if you haven't yet studied from last week's learning, you can go on to my YouTube channel and review this as well. So this is the opening passage of Tractate Kiddushin. All Talmudic tractates start on page 2. That has to do with the way in which folios were bound I think actually in the Renaissance. It is a pretty late development of enumerating the pages of Talmud. Maybe it's older than 700 years. I'm not sure. 600 years. Hayisha niknet bashalosh drachim. A woman is acquired, that is to say, she becomes betrothed to a man to be his wife in three ways and can acquire herself or terminate her marriage. In other words, become independent of her husband in two ways. There are two authorized ways of doing that. The Mishnah elaborates she is acquired through kesef, shtar, which means a document or a writ, and bia, which is a euphemism that means sexual intercourse. So any, or more importantly, all three of these are they say a derech, an avenue or a way, a path through which a marriage is effectuated. Um, and then there's a debate between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel over, well, how much money? Let's start with the first one, which says there needs to be there needs to be a financial transaction here. Beit Shammai has a somewhat more stringent standard by saying you can acquire through 1 dinar, which is a larger sum than Beit Hillel proposes, which is 1 peruta, as it says here in the Steinsaltz gloss, a small copper coin or anything worth 1 peruta. So technically, as I said last week, a marriage can be effectuated through the exchange or through the transfer from the groom to the bride of any item of even very modest value. You could hand your bride, a scarf or a toaster, and it would probably count under the technicalities of this law as worth 1 peruta and therefore uh, effectuates marriage. I may not have said this last week, but I want to make it clear that the Beit Hillel position, which prevails, is also consistent with much Jewish law that wants to make it clear that anything that we could call a sacrament, if we were Christians, we use the word kodesh, and we spent a long time in last week's lesson unpacking the meanings of the word kodesh, holy, because the word for marriage is kiddushin, which actually indicates that it is directly related to this notion of holiness. So in Judaism, we talk about holiness. The Christian term, the exact Latinate translation of holy is sacra, sacred, sacrament. So, Jewishly speaking, this is a Kodesh thing or a sacrament. And when it comes to sacramental, uh, the domain of the sacred in Judaism, the idea is that the rich should not have greater access than the poor, right? So there are customs that you may be familiar with from Jewish life that are derived from that larger principle. Again, the principle being that the domain of the sacred should not be the privilege of the rich, but should be as accessible to anyone, regardless of wealth, as possible, while still fulfilling a minimum financial requirement that allows the transaction to be legally recognized. Um, the other one that is probably famous to you is the burial custom that Jews are buried in a plain pine box and not an elaborate, ornate coffin. And the Talmud itself explicates that precept by saying, so that the rich cannot have access to burial in the Jewish tradition above what the poor can afford. Does that make sense? So the idea that you don't need a diamond ring to acquire a bride, just a small copper coin will suffice, or a ring worth a very small amount, like out of like a trinket is sufficient. The operating principle behind that may well be that marriage is, as it were, a sacrament. It belongs to the domain of the Kodesh, the holy in Judaism, and therefore needs to be as accessible as possible to anyone. No one should be deprived the right to marry because of lack of wealth. So then they go into, well, what is a pruta? Because that's not, even by the time the Talmud is unpacking this, or the Mishnah is written, there may be some discrepancy over the value of this coin, which suggests that that was not the currency of the time or place. We did not get to paragraph 2, so this is what we'll read. because it's really a direct continuation. V'konat atzma beget. So a woman, as it were, acquires herself or buys herself back, attains her independence from her husband, beget, an Aramaic word meaning a writ of divorce. You've heard of this word, of course. So this is, she needs a get in order to be divorced from her husband. Uv mitatabal. Well, that's the other condition that can effectuate the termination of a marriage is if the husband dies. Mitat habal from mit, and Baal means husband. So, and yes, if you're thinking, wait a minute, I thought Baal was the name of a Canaanite deity, like Baal Peor. It's the same word. Baal means master, husband, lord. It is absolutely a word that conveys patriarchal power imbalance between men and women, but it is the conventional word even today for a husband. So, a woman, these are the two ways a woman can have a marriage terminated either the acquisition of a get, which has to be provided by the husband, or the death of the husband. And then it provides for a circumstance that most of us non-Orthodox Jews may not be familiar with. Hayivama niknet bevia. The levir, the woman uh, whose husband died childless. This woman is known as a yivama. The convention in biblical practice, and this actually is derived from the Bible and is maintained and actually reinforced in Talmudic law, is that if a man and a woman are married and the husband dies and the marriage has not produced children, then the brother of the deceased husband is legally obligated to take the widow as his wife for the express purpose of producing an heir or heirs. And those children are imputed to the dead husband as his heirs. There are stories in the Hebrew Bible that actually narrate this in narrative form. Most famously, the story that will become about Judah and Tamar. So if you read Genesis chapter 37, there's a story about this, and levirate marriage also features prominently in the fourth and last chapter of the book of Ruth, which we'll be reading on Shavuot. We don't need to go too deep into that. It might be a meaningful digression if there are lots of questions about levirate marriage, but I would warn you ahead of time. I'm far from an expert in it, and I didn't spend a lot of time preparing levirate marriage for our course because it really isn't. It doesn't inform most Jewish practice today, even in the Orthodox world. Um, the the woman whose husband dies with no children having been produced from the marriage is known as a yivama. The brother of the deceased husband who has to marry the widow is known as a yavam. And the act of levirate marriage, the act of this legally required marriage for the purpose of producing children in the name of the dead husband is known in Hebrew as yibum. So Yivama is, in this case, the woman. Yavam is the brother or proximate male in the family who is required to marry the woman, the widow. And Yibum is the institution of what we call levirate marriage. All of this is elaborated over much paper in Tractate Yevamot, which is a whole Talmudic tractate devoted to the subject of levirate marriage. I'm going to finish the text and then we'll take questions because I know that this is an intriguing, if somewhat obscure subject. So how does levirate marriage get effectuated? Well, it says in these three words here, hayivama, that is to say, the woman whose husband died, leaving them childless, niknet, is acquired bevia, with intercourse. So there need be no ketubah or exchange of money. Quite literally, according to this text, the brother of the deceased husband steps in and occupies the marital bed, has intercourse, and it is an effectuated marriage. The marriage takes effect. V'kona et atzma, and she can terminate such a levirate marriage. B'chalitza, there are two conditions by which a woman can terminate a levirate marriage. A traditional or legally recognized marriage, which requires, as it said, a shtar, a document. We know this shtar as a ketubah, which is a covenant of marriage or a wedding contract, is terminated through another opposite document called a get. Right? Everyone follows that. A levirate marriage is terminated, or by the death of the husband. A levirate marriage is terminated in one of two ways, and a get is not required. It says by halitzah, we'll talk about what halitzah is in a second, or by the death of the yavam, of the lever, of the levir, of the surrogate husband. I think levir, the best way I can translate it is the brother who becomes the surrogate husband. Because there was no ketubah, there was no document that authorized the marriage, and yet the marriage was made legitimate. The levirate marriage was made legitimate through intercourse. You do not need a get. You do not need an opposite or corresponding document to terminate the marriage. Instead, you need something called halitzah. So, what is halitzah? Halitzah is a ritual where, upon mutual agreement to terminate the levirate marriage, the levir, that is to say, the surrogate husband, who is conventionally the brother of the deceased, doffs his shoe. He takes off his shoe and he makes a proclamation that basically says this marriage is terminated in front of at least two authorized witnesses standing in for the Jewish community, and the marriage is terminated. These days, chalitza is the required norm in the case of what would otherwise be a levirate marriage. So if you go to the ultra Orthodox world, chalitza is still performed, but chalitza is actually the de facto norm. We default to chalitza. In other words, take the case in say we're in Kiryas Yol, you know, 25 minutes from here in Rockland County, ultra Orthodox black hat neighborhood. A woman is married to a man, the man dies, leaving them childless. The man has the next in line brother who is eligible to marry. He takes the wife, according to the law of levirate marriage, he would take the wife uh, as a as a function of his being the brother of the deceased. In other words, it is his levirate obligation to marry as the yavam. She is the yivamah. The Talmud Jewish law stipulates that they need to do yibum. They need to do levirate marriage. He's got to get into her bed after Shiva and have intercourse with this woman in order to produce an heir. However, modern Jewish practice, even in Orthodoxy, is that we don't do that anymore, but they still have to go through the ritual to make clear that although the Talmud provides for levirate marriage, we're not doing it, and we have the right or the obligation not to do it under Jewish law. So he takes off his shoe, he makes the traditional halitzah declaration, and they are both released from the obligation of levirate marriage. And then the last line in this little sugya, this little paragraph, says, Uvamitat habal. In other words, or uvamitat yavam, if the levir dies, that would also terminate the levirate marriage. Okay. I'm a little bit concerned you're going to ask me questions that I can't answer because I have just provided you the sum total of everything I know about levirate marriage, which I'm sure is what you could just find if you looked it up on Wikipedia. Like this is actually part of basic Reform Jewish rabbinic training. I am sure that my Orthodox colleagues know more about this subject, but I'll do my best. So, Michelle, I saw your hand first.
At the risk of taking you where we don't want to
Fine.
go,
It's fine.
just a couple things. First, since I just read the bit in Leviticus about leverage marriage because I was prepping Ruth, the book of Ruth, I note that it says they should marry the brother. It does not say if he's unmarried. By the
Correct.
time of your rabbinic interpretations, I believe there at some point, and I don't know the timing,
Neither
there
do I.
is a determination that you have one wife, not multiple.
Yeah. And that
Um,
would be why halitzah comes into effect. So much
well,
so that the assumption is that, well, if the brother's already married, he is released of his obligation on the strict fact that we don't tolerate polygamy in Judaism, in rabbinic Judaism.
and then I wanted to distinguish when you're talking about getting a get to end a marriage, that implies that there has already been a ketubah and a marriage. Whereas this chalitza you're talking, or this
Yeah.
ceremony you're talking about is, it sounds to me like it is to rescind or to stop the obligation for the levirate marriage rather than the marriage has been consummated and now we're ending it.
Both and. The text makes clear here that it can be used to terminate a levirate marriage. The presumption, if I'm recalling correctly, and I'm going back, more than 25 years to my Talmud and codes classes, but once the heir has been produced, once the mitzvah of pru uravu, of bearing children, has been fulfilled, the levir I mean, the function of the levirate marriage has now been accomplished, and therefore halitzah is not only permitted but encouraged at this point. Particularly since, look, none of these marriages were founded on romance. They were founded on necessity, convenience, economic arrangement, and especially producing inheritance, producing heirs. If the heir has been produced, the levir can be released of his obligation through the performance of halitzah. These days, it is always preemptive. Like before he even gets in bed with the widow, halitzah is performed to make clear that he has fulfilled his obligation as the levir, and ceremonially, through this ritual, is not actually obligated to go through with it. It's one of those weird things. It kind of shows you, like, what do we learn from this? We sometimes learn the the willingness of Jewish practice to twist itself into knots in order to uphold the letter of the law, right? So that rather than saying the law is invalid, which is the reform approach, by the way, I am proudly reform in that I would say halakha gets a vote, but not a veto for me. Like halakha is one of many governing determinants of Jewish life, the way I live it and in the community that I serve and in which I live and practice. And that's true for the conservative movement too. It goes back to the thing we said before I started the recording today, which was just sort of a conversation that picked up from last night's big format dialogue that I enjoyed with Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the ADL, in WRT, which is that norms, I believe, actually are more indicative of the real stuff of Jewish life than Jewish law. So community norms, even though they're not often or always written down, if you want to understand what Judaism is, you really got to look at how communities practice, because so much of what we do is governed by communal norms. So, but in the Orthodox world, the halakha still has to match the norm. So if the norm is that we don't actually want the brothers of dead husbands to get into bed with the widow to produce an heir, which we don't anymore, we still have to say the law is in effect, but then we need a new ceremony, or we have to uphold a biblical ceremony to annul the practice rather than just canceling the original Torah law. Because remember, levirate marriage, and Michelle corroborates this, is from the Torah. So some of this is also about the authority that the rabbis imputed to themselves versus the authority that the rabbis imputed to the Torah. Whenever possible, the rabbis want to uphold the Torah as kind of the ultimate source of law, which they do not have the authority to override explicitly. Instead, the rabbis come up with loopholes so that they can say, we upheld the Torah law, we just did a thing that we innovated, or another biblical practice in this case, that we now institute as the norm so that we can say that we're within the parameters of what the Torah provides. We don't just do what Reform Jews do, which is say, I am an informed Reform Jew, and I am making an informed autonomous choice. Although I know the law, I am choosing not to follow it. That's a very reform way of thinking. It's how I think. Like, yeah, I know that Leviticus chapter 20 says that it is a sin for two men to conjugate together in a homosexual arrangement. Right? The Torah makes that very clear. Doesn't say anything about lesbianism, by the way. But I'm aware of the law, and I will say, yes, but my understanding of Judaism is informed by 3,000 following years, not just of Jewish practice, but of shifting norms, of medical science, and of changing social, mores that not just permit me, but in fact compel me as a Jew to affirm the love between two homosexual men, two gay men who want to get married. And I will come up with Jewish language and Jewish ritual to do that. That is a fundamental difference, irreconcilable between how I practice Judaism and how I lead Jewish community from my dear friend Jonathan Morgenstern at Young Israel of Scarsdale. Because even today, there is no halachic workaround for gay marriage, right? There's no halachic workaround for lobster roll, as much as I wish there were. Right? There's just no way to say, I have a counter-prevailing halitzah-like ritual that allows me to eat a lobster roll while still saying I didn't violate Jewish law. Levirate marriage, there is. There's a halachic workaround. There's a loophole. And in fact, the loophole becomes the norm, and the law itself is not invalidated. It is just not upheld. Okay, we're into some pretty abstract stuff here, but I think it's actually this is what's important to me about this conversation. It's not that I want us all to be mavens, experts in levirate marriage. Like that's not going to be a thing that as a Reform Jew or as a non-Orthodox Jew you need in life, unless you want to show off to your conservative and Orthodox friends the next time someone talks about it and you're like, "Oh, did this couple do halitzah?" Like I don't think that's going to come up. Okay, mom and dad.
The other example that comes to mind about this is the eruv, that you can string a telephone wire around the whole city and you're still only in your garden, if you
Right,
believe that.
exactly. That's a great example where the Talmud provides a way for people to travel increasingly further distances, which of course was made necessary by the advent of increasing dispersion of the Jewish community. Right? The Eruv you can think of as a diaspora phenomenon and or a phenomenon that is intrinsically linked to the increasing urbanization of Jewish communities. And when you're living in a city, all of a sudden the idea of what is a public domain and what is a private domain is enlarged, and you want it to include the entire city because you have a different geographic parameter for how you understand your Jewish community. So the Talmud provides for a physical boundary that can be placed, authorized by the Talmud, authorized by the Jewish community and by Jewish law, that appears to allow, but that doesn't appear to, that allows further travel than would otherwise be permitted. You haven't broken the law, you've adopted a loophole that allows the law to be upheld. Orthodox Jews go through these machinations all the time. Like if you've ever lived inside Orthodox community or spent a weekend with your Orthodox friends, you might observe some very strange things. The one that I love is that many Orthodox households unscrew and remove the light bulbs from their refrigerators. Can anyone figure out why? I mean, when I open a fridge, particularly when I want my midnight snack, I want there to be some illumination. But Orthodox Jews often, the first thing they do when they install a new refrigerator in their home is they take the light bulb out. Well, what's that all about? Okay, I'll tell you. They don't want to violate the Sabbath, right? There's no problem, presumably under halakha, there's no problem opening a fridge to get a snack on a Saturday at 2 p.m. There is a problem with turning on a light. Therefore, just take the light bulb out. And therefore you've upheld the letter of the law at only a modest inconvenience. But you might say, as a Reform Jew, as a non-Orthodox Jew, well, this is narishkeit. Like, why would I? My dear friend, mentor, Rabbi Larry Hoffman, was invited in by the noted Broadway director, Bartlett Sher. Bart Sher, who produced, among other things, a number of successful revivals of Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals like South Pacific at the Vivian Beaumont Theater in the Round at Lincoln Center. They did a revival of Fiddler on the Roof probably more than 10 years ago at this point. It starred Danny Burstein and a mostly non-Jewish cast. That's a relevant detail. Bart Scher knows Rabbi Hoffman and asked him to come in and meet with the cast to explain the world of Tevye the Dairyman to a mostly non-Jewish cast so that they could truly appreciate what they were doing when they were, for instance, choreographing the Sabbath dinner for Sunrise, Sunset, and some of the other beautiful, really Jewish um, scenes in Fiddler. And Larry sat down with the cast and he explained to them. So he had to explain orthodoxy, shtetl orthodoxy, in terms that would be understandable to a non-Jewish group of performers. And he said, the Judaism of Tevye and his world is about the spirituality of detail. This is one of my favorite phrases. This is how Larry explains the appeal, the pull of Orthodox Judaism, is that it is a set of norms enshrined in Jewish law, but the law isn't the thing. It's about the norms that force the attention of the participant in the tradition to every little detail of the day. Right? You can't go. We talk so much in today's spiritual jargon about mindfulness. Larry makes a very strong case that orthodoxy is, in its way, a deeply mindful tradition, or it's a tradition that inculcates mindfulness because it is very hard to go through Jewish life as an Orthodox Jew mindlessly. You could make the counter argument that yes, but if you've memorized the prayer book and you're just davening and shuckling and not paying attention to the words, you can be mindless about things like prayer. But I think the basic argument about the spirituality of detail really holds. That orthodoxy forces you to think about what we might consider mundane actions as residing in the domain of the potentially sanctified. I could go on at quite some length about this because it really is one of my favorite subjects on which to ruminate, but we're going to move on. Okay, so that's a little bit on levirate marriage. Um, so we've learned about the norms through which Jewish marriage is effectuated. There needs to be a transfer of money or an item of one pruta's value, not a lot. There needs to be a document, a writ of marriage called ketubah, and there needs to be a intercourse. For the purpose of the marriage ceremony, the wedding ceremony in Jewish life, there are three symbols provided, and we mentioned this last week, to stand for each of those three required commitments. A ring is exchanged, which is why the heart of the ceremony, by the way, the first thing that the Talmud mentions is kesef, is money. And by the way, if you've ever read, how many of you have like an Orthodox ketubah? Anyone? Probably a lot of you, I'm guessing. Yeah. Orthodox ketubah is not actually written principally in Hebrew. The first paragraph's in Hebrew, but the rest of it is in Aramaic, which is the language of Jewish antiquity for, it was the vernacular. So it's also the language of transaction, the language of, just sort of like negotiations in business, and all contracts were written in Aramaic. So because the ketubah is actually a contract, it's written in Aramaic. It's written like a business document. It's very legalesque or legally. There's a lot of legalese, and you can break your teeth pronouncing it. I've had to read a traditional Aramaic ketubah a number of times under a chuppah. Often when I co-officiate with an Orthodox rabbi, the first time I was asked to do this was, I think, in like, I don't know, 2009, 2010. I was co-officiating with a pretty frum rabbi, a pretty Orthodox rabbi. I mean, not like pay us beard, but strict. And he said, "Well, Rabbi, I'd be happy." Like he gave me all sorts of things that I couldn't do at the wedding according to his practice. He wanted to claim all of the halakhic stuff. He said, "But I'd be happy for you to read the ketubah if you're able." And This is for a congregant of mine who was marrying an Orthodox groom. I love both families, by the way. And when I heard that, my competitive, mettle was being tested. So I thought to myself, game on, buddy. Then Kelly will tell you, I practiced as hard for that damn ketubah reading as I did for my bar mitzvah. I probably spent 45 minutes a night for 2 to 3 weeks just practicing reading Aramaic because when you go to HUC, you just don't do a lot of Aramaic. It's actually one of the gaps in my education that I haven't tried to plug the gap. I've just tried to improve over time so that when I'm studying Talmud, I really try to break my teeth on the Aramaic, but it's not intuitive. Some of us know some Aramaic, like if you've ever recited Kaddish before, that is Aramaic as well. Uh, but Ketubah Aramaic is really, really tangly. Anyway, I did fine. I've done it a number of times since, and so much so I now tell young Reform rabbis and rabbinical students that it's one of the handful of things that they should just learn how to do before they're ordained, because you never know when you're going to be asked. It's just one of those things that, and by the way, it's sort of like an entrance ticket, I think, to rabbinic life. It's just one of those things where we shouldn't give Orthodox rabbis any further cause to demean or diminish or disparage non-Orthodox rabbis. We should be able to speak the same language, even if we don't practice the same way. That's my view. Anyway, the ketubah itself, though, was all about money. It basically says, and if the husband fails to uphold his marital obligations, which, by the way, the ketubah stipulates are um, uh, he must provide her with food, with clothing, and with marital satisfaction. It was a very interesting euphemistic phrase that probably means sex or possibly children. So if after trying to bear children, a couple cannot produce children, that actually can constitute grounds for marriage, grounds for termination of the marriage through a get in a bilateral way. So whether who is infertile is not important, nor would that have been known in antiquity. Today, science allows us to determine, which partner's biology is standing in the way of producing children. But that is one of the grounds for marriage. But so is a woman who is left destitute by her husband. Obviously, cases of overt abuse or mistreatment, those are grounds for divorce. So the ketubah is intended to protect the woman from mistreatment or the husband's failure to uphold the basics of a marital agreement. But the main language of the ketubah is a financial transaction because it imposes on the husband a preemptive financial penalty for failure to uphold his obligation. So husbands go into marriages, brides do too, grooms and brides go into marriage knowing that it is not a consequence-free decision if they decide to terminate. If either party decides to terminate, the husband will owe the wife a certain sum of money. That is not bilateral. That is not reciprocal. The assumption being, of course, that women did not have means to furnish for themselves, right? So it is too much of a stretch, I think, to call a ketubah a feminist document. I sometimes, when I'm meeting with couples where I explain all of this. We do a lot of didactic learning with all of my premarital, pre-wedding couples. Um, I try to explain that it is like a prenup in some ways. It's not feminist, but it is kind of proto-feminist because it recognizes that the situation of women in the Bible, that they could be taken and summarily dismissed by husbands, that there is no protection, is not one that the rabbis were willing to tolerate. And I think that shows an early reform to Judaism that advances the tradition morally and strategically. Mara.
Um, no. Oh, so let's say that a couple they get married and they discover that he is infertile.
Yeah.
Does his brother step in?
No. Well, only after a get is issued.
Oh, okay.
And then in that case, the brother would have no obligation. So the obligation of levirate marriage is imposed only upon the death of the husband. Death is the only condition that effectuates levirate or that prompts levirate marriage, which again in Talmudic law can be canceled by the halitzah ritual, and in today's practice must be canceled by the halitzah ritual. Right, but a normal garden variety divorce does not create a circumstance for levirate marriage. But it is required that a woman get a get from her husband, now ex-husband, in order to remarry. And we're going to get to this in a few weeks, because otherwise, any future progeny from the woman coupling with another man will be considered illegitimate. Unless a woman has a get, she is not authorized to remarry. And what's really on the line for it are future children. That's why, by the way, when I do second marriages for couples where the wife is a divorcee, I make it clear to them, like they will often say to me, "Well, Rabbi, I was married. Yes, he was Jewish, I'm Jewish, but we didn't get a get. Will you remarry? But we've been legally divorced for several years. Will you remarry me to this other man without a get?" And as a Reform rabbi, I say, I will, though you should know what this is all about. And particularly if it's a woman in her 60s or older, I might say, look, this is really only an issue if you're planning to have children with your next husband. If she says, no, Rabbi, we're not at this point, then I'll say, okay, then a get is really not, it serves no practical function, although it is still the correct thing to do under Jewish law. So if you want to get, I can help, I can help facilitate a process where you can get a get. Joe, unmute.
I just wanted to know, who was Khrushchev trying to divorce when he took his shoe off at the UN?
I have no idea.
I just threw that in.
All these ancient Near Eastern practices that involve the removing of shoes, I don't quite get it. I probably would need to be an anthropologist. Oh, did I lose you all? Hang on. Crap. Oh, I lost you for a second, right?
No,
Oh,
we're
okay, good. Someone's screen froze. All right. So I don't know, but the ancient Near East seem to have an obsession with taking shoes off. I don't know what it means. In
Well,
today's
when you throw a shoe at somebody, you're putting the filth of the earth, and hurling it at somebody, right? That's
Yeah.
what the bottom of your shoe comes in contact with.
Right. So again, in order to understand why the halitzah ritual involves the removal of a shoe and the swearing of an oath, I'd need to be an anthropologist, not a rabbi. But I'm sure somebody's looked into it. It is a fascinating little weird custom. I've never actually witnessed it in person, but okay. Uh, so why don't we, Karen, you wrote Shabbat refrigerator in a private message to me. That I think you were answering my question before. Right, it's a Shabbat thing. Yeah, I don't think they sell Shabbat refrigerators to Orthodox Jews, but what do I know? I've never shopped in Muncie. Maybe they do. Um, they make Shabbat elevators.
Yeah, they do make Shabbat
Yeah, there's a
refrigerators.
whole institute in Jerusalem called the Institute for Science and Halakha, which sounds very Star Trekky. It's not. It's actually where rabbis, scientists, engineers collaborate to come up with technological or technical mechanical workarounds for halachic restrictions on modern life.
So
Right?
all you need is an on-off switch, a simple fix in
It
the
is, it's on a timer.
refrigerator.
Yeah,
So,
yes, you can do some fridges on a timer.
yeah, I know because I was shopping when we first got a house and there were Shabbat refrigerators.
There you go. Somebody's thought of this before me. I could have made a mint on it. Joe?
Isn't it just as good just to unscrew the light for a day?
Yeah,
Leave
they
it.
can do. People do that too. And there are
Okay.
all sorts of other workarounds. Like one of my favorites is that you're not allowed to carry on Shabbat. But many Orthodox Jews will, for instance, uphold that prohibition by wearing their house keys like a necklace. And then they can say, I'm not carrying. It's jewelry. Okay,
Also,
again,
also, a baby carriage is also allowed within that.
that's right. A
Within
baby
an A roof.
carriage
I
is
don't
allowed,
think
and of
it's
course, we
allowed
haven't even
outside.
acknowledged anything that could save life is allowed. So you can violate the Sabbath to save life. Michelle?
Yeah, I just want to point out that while these things sound technical or obscure or silly to us, they serve what I think you referred to earlier, which is they're a constant reminder of your connection to the community and your connection to God.
Beautiful. Right. I do want to bring it home to that because when you're standing outside of a community that you don't understand from the inside, it is easy to take swipes. And I hear too much of that at WRT. And I would much rather that we stand in a kind of symmetrical appreciation for Jewish practice that is not like ours. Believe me, if I could demand it of my co-religionists who practice Orthodoxy or conservative Judaism to grant us the same kind of compassionate curiosity and respect, I would. But I can only inculcate values for the community that I serve. It's not my job to tell Orthodox and conservative congregations how they should behave. I think in the context of WRT, our value set should invite us to look at orthodoxy or practice that is different from reform with compassionate curiosity and with as little negative judgment as possible. Walk a mile in their shoes before they doff them for halitzah. Okay. Judy Gross, please.
I know in our courses when of women in the Bible, and we've discussed in Rosh Chodesh, we're discussing feminism in through our faith, and we've read stories of Orthodox women and people voice their horror at what they have to go through. And I tell you, you have to remind yourself this is their life. They choose this, and I think there has to be some respect shown to people who of that faith or whatever they're going
Yeah,
through. And
absolutely. Thank you. Audrey.
Well, I just want to say that respect and curiosity, whatever, should go both ways. You know,
Yeah,
that my
sure.
first cousin is the Rebbe in Lakewood, and they treat me as a complete know-nothing. I guess I'm not even Jewish. And, you know, that breeds tremendous resentment. And, you know, obviously through all the courses I've taken with you and WRT and in college, it's not that I know nothing. And it's creates a lot of ill will.
I, yeah, I both appreciate and value your sharing that, and also I have a lot of sympathy for you in that situation. It's unfortunate. Well, the next time you're there, you can take your shoes off and say, "Don't worry, I'm not doing halitzah," and see how they respond. Okay, I'm going to move us forward for a little bit more learning that I think will find valuable. So uh, the tractate that we began, Kiddushin, um, engages in the question of marriage uh, comprehensively. And I'm skipping ahead a great number of dapim, a great number of Talmudic pages to page 29b. Um, Somebody should mute. Okay. Okay. So we are looking at 29b, Kiddushin, 29b, paragraph 14, as indicated here on Safaria. Tanu Rabbanan. So Tanu is always a tell that we're going back to the Mishnah, the time of the Mishnah for a Mishnaic teaching. Lilmod Torah v'lisa isha, whether to study Torah or take a wife. So that's the question that we're entertaining. To study Torah or take a wife, in other words, which should you do first? If you have to choose between getting married or learning Torah, so this is aimed at probably an adolescent yeshiva bocher. We know that, and it's framed here as I would call it a Jewish ethical dilemma, right? We know that both of these are paramount obligations for men, young men in Jewish life. You have to take a wife, you have to learn Torah. But those two are not always compatible with each other because they require a certain level of full dedication and attention to Torah if you choose to study Torah without a lot of material reward for it. Right? We know that a life of learning Torah is not financially remunerative. This, by the way, does underscore the condition of many in the Haredi community, that the men are off learning Torah. They're not making money to do it. The value is purely spiritual. And the women are the breadwinners, as well as a robust, if closed, welfare network within the Haredi community, right? So the Haredi do look out for their own in the sense that they have a lot of support for the indigent in their community, but a lot of people in the community are indigent. Again, subjects for other days of study. So continuing, whether to study Torah or take a wife. Yilmod Torah, v'achar kach isa isha. You should learn Torah, or he should learn Torah, and afterwards take a wife. Vim efshar lo belo isha. But if it is impossible for him to go without a wife, belo isha, not to have a wife, isa isha v'achar kach yilmod Torah. He should take a wife and afterward learn Torah. What would make it impossible for him not to have a wife? Probably increasing age and unfulfilled sexual desire, right? So one of the things I talk about with teenagers is that we're living in a time where it is complicated to hold up the Jewish norm of no sex before marriage, because that norm was established at a time where people were getting married in adolescence when one reaches sexual maturity, or the hormones, your body is telling you go, 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 go. The tradition is saying not before marriage. Society is saying don't get married at 14, please. Like, and waiting another 15, 20 years before having sex, like I tell kids, like that is probably not what Judaism had in mind. So the reform movement has, I think, very thoughtfully generated and proposed different or a whole set of ethical parameters that should govern sexual relationships, even if the couple is not married. Again, the idea being that Judaism probably did not have in mind a decade or more of celibacy. You following? Okay. So therefore, it's saying, well, if you have to choose between studying Torah and taking a wife, you should learn Torah. But if you're absolutely unable to do that, then take a wife and then learn Torah. Okay, so that I think is what's being driven at here. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Rabbi Judah in the name of Shmuel says, halakha, the halakha is nosei shavar karchach yimod Torah. He actually says, no, this is the law. Take a wife early and then learn Torah. But he goes on in the dialogue, the Talmud goes on to provide a counter opinion or an interjection by Rabbi Yochanan Amar. Rabbi Yochanan says, Rechaim b'tzavaro va'asok b'Torah. He's literally got a millstone around his neck, and you're telling him that he should engage in Torah? In other words, now that he has a wife and presumably a kid on the way or more, how will he have time for Torah study? He should be learning first and then, then a wife, but he needs an income. Goes on to say, Vila plige, which means, no, actually, there's not an argument here. Ha-lan v'ha-lahu. One of these applies for us and one for them. And it's actually saying that we can have two different customs among the Jewish people. One in Babylonia, where the custom was to take a wife first and then learn Torah. But in Eretz Yisrael, you can learn Torah and then take a wife. So he reconciles the difference without actually getting to the crux of the matter, which is how can you do this? But in my view, it's actually problematic either way, because any number of years that are spent learning Torah are not going to be productive years for earning an income. Like I spent the first 26 years of my life in academia, and did not start earning until I became a rabbi. And then I got married. Like that was my order was lots of Torah learning, get a job, take a wife. but it's, I'm more intrigued by the way in which the tradition is grappling with the need to fulfill all of these things. You got to make a living. You're supposed to be in a family, and you're supposed to learn Torah. Young men are especially obligated to learn Torah, and that the three don't always comfortably, they are not comfortably compatible. So you have to come up with an order for these things, and there are trade-offs and compromises no matter what you do, mom and dad.
This is not at all different from what couples do today. Pursuing graduate degrees, man and woman. And, I appreciate what you said about your time frame and getting married to Kelly. And you know that mom and I got married actually before we finished undergraduate school. And then I went on to medical school. So this is a very contemporary dilemma.
It is indeed. It is elaborated a couple paragraphs down here, where it says Rav Huna. So Rav Huna, litame de Amar. Rav Huna follows the way he usually reasons. So apparently, I don't know enough about Rav Huna, but he has similar arguments elsewhere in the Gemara. Ben esrim shana velo nasa isha. So if a person reaches 20 years old and is still not taken a wife, that's the paragraph, that's the line I've highlighted here. Kol yamav ba'avera. He will be living his entire existence in sin. Ba'avera salka da'atach, which is, the Gemara says, wait a minute. He really will be in, your opinion is that he will be in sin? Ela ema. Rather, you should say, Kol yamav bihir hor avera. It's not that he will be living in sin, it's that he will be contemplating sin. So again, this is sort of what I conjectured before, and here it is written plain, that the expectation is that part of the reason that young people were getting married off, first of all, if life expectancy is not much older than 40, that does change your intended timeline for all of these things. Secondly, though, the point that I was making is that the Talmud recognizes that the driving force of sexual desire is a very powerful one indeed. And if it is not fulfilled with a woman, this person is not going to be a very good Torah scholar anyway, because all he's going to be thinking about is getting it on with anyone. So better to marry off young in order for sexual desire not to go unfulfilled. Okay, so it's interesting, the Talmud is not only speaking in a language that is arcane and abstract. It really is speaking to, my dad made this case, I'm just adding to it. It's speaking to the dilemmas that real people in the real world, even today, are still grappling with, perhaps differently, but I think the issues at play are not dissimilar. And the follow-up to that, it continues as follows. So there's actually, as is the way of the Talmud, a fairly long discussion around this. I'll just skip to the English for time's sake. Rava said, and similarly the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, until one reaches the age of 20 years, the Holy One, blessed be God, sits and waits for a man, saying, when will he marry a woman? Once he reaches the age of 20 and is not yet married, God says, let his bones swell. In other words, that is a bit of a strange euphemism, by the way. I don't know if that's like what we would euphemistically call blue balls or something like that. I don't know if we're talking about actual bones or if that's a kind of a crass euphemism here. Maybe. The point is that this is not good. Not good for a man to be alone. That's not a rabbinic precept. That's a Torah precept. It's an early Torah precept. That's exactly why we looked at this last week. God splits the original bigendered human, the Adam, into two sides, an Adam and a Chava, an earth being, an earthling, and a life force. That's what the names mean, by the way. Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. One means earth stuff, and the other means life or life force. Chava is like chai. So Adam and Eve, you take matter and life force, and there's a whole really interesting, we're not getting to it today, But there's a really interesting stuff I was reading in Talmud just last night around was God's design for humanity um, the idea that we're basically men and women are actually one. It's a unitary entity, but they were split into two genders in order to recouple, right? So it's really interesting just like how Judaism understands gender. It's that the two genders are actually two sides of one coin, as opposed to different entities. We belong together. That of course, comes up against a significant um, challenge, given the fact that probably the better part of 10% of people across the world uh, are not attracted to the opposite sex and are attracted to the same sex. Like that's actually the medical community has basically established as fact that sexual orientation is a biologically driven norm, and that a very significant number of people, you know, many, 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 many times the number of Jews in the world are the number of people who are gay and who are not attracted to the opposite sex. So do with it what you will, but that's just a fact on the ground. So that goes against the idea that the genders are kind of baked into God's plan for the universe of coupling. But that's again subject for a different morning. Ann Cohen, please. Looking for the microphone. It's in the lower left corner of your screen. Okay, when you find out how to, yep, there you are.
Here I am. Uh, I don't know. How do women, I always felt, were treated unfairly and that we were really not treated the way, with the respect that men are treated.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. When I was just a kid, I would say under 12, I wanted to go to Hebrew school. I wanted to learn. I wasn't interested in the party after the bat mitzvah. I actually wanted to learn. And I was told, you don't have to go to Hebrew school. You're a girl. And I didn't like that.
Well, I will post in I think that Anne is correct that we should not lose sight of the fact that no matter how progressive the innovation of the rabbinic tradition is, and I really do believe that it is progressive. I'm not politicizing that term. I'm saying that progress is initiated by rabbinic innovation. Um, However, uh, the it should not be overlooked, nor can it be overstated, that at root, the Jewish tradition, both in the Tanakh, in the Torah, the Bible, and in rabbinic law, is still fundamentally patriarchal. It does not impose a rigorous equality of the sexes. That is very far off. We'd have to wait another 2,000 years for some streams of Judaism to endorse that particular doctrine of gender equality.
What, excuse me, sorry.
No, ask your question.
What can we do now to make some progress? I do write and I have a website, but I don't know I mean, it's nice if people look at my website, but I don't even know if I'm writing about this stuff. I just write what I want to write.
Oh, I mean, I think that just participating in the life of Reform Judaism is demonstrative of one's commitment to rigorous egalitarianism, and that practicing Reform Judaism publicly and proudly is the best possible response to the built-in patriarchy of Judaism. Like that we should never back down or apologize for the fact that we are rigorously committed to the equality of the sexes in our practice of Judaism. Like, look at WRT. Look at who leads the congregation on any given day. More than half of our board is female. Over the last 30 years, most of our temple presidents have been female. Our clergy team is half female right now. You know, uh, two of our rabbis, sorry, yeah, Rabbi Citrin and Rabbi Platkow and Cantor Kleinman, all women. So, I mean, it's like, I think we're living it. And of course, outside of Judaism too. But in support of Anne's point, I will put in the chat window an article that I came across that I really recommend. It's, you know, it's intense, but it does point out the inequalities of traditional marriage under Jewish law. So it's called Acquiring Equality. And it does point out that, well, the whole idea that a woman can be acquired in the first place is an inescapable fundamental of Jewish marriage that is patriarchal in nature. So I find this really interesting. Again, I think Reform Judaism responds to this in some very meaningful ways through innovation. Okay, let me give you a teaser of what we're going to be looking at next time. Or actually, there's an asterisk next to next time, and I'll explain what I mean. Uh, sorry, I moved a few tabs around in order to get that article up on the screen. So in the tractate of Ketubot. So we've been looking thus far at tractate Kiddushin. In tractate Ketubot, which is the tractate about ketubas, Jewish wedding covenants, we actually learn about the blessings that are recited in order to effectuate a marriage, right? So we know that the core responsibilities or the core paths for marriage to be effectuated are exchange of a ring, exchange of an item of value, a writ of marriage known as a ketubah, and intercourse, which I forgot to mention this week, but did mention last week, is symbolized through the construction of a chuppah or a wedding canopy. The three elements that effectuate Jewish marriage are then threaded together with a ritual in which blessings are recited. And when you go to a Jewish wedding, when I conduct a Jewish wedding, when my Orthodox, I mean, the irony about an Orthodox rabbi saying, you can only do this part and I have to do this part is I've been to many Jewish weddings. Orthodox, conservative, reform, renewal. If you are doing a Jewish wedding, I don't care whether you're a reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi or an Orthodox rabbi. Fundamentally, the ritual is the same. There's a Seder to it, by which I mean not a Passover Seder. Seder just means an order. Seder is the word we use to describe a liturgy or sequence of prayers, rituals, and music that connect along an idea or a narrative, not only to tell a story, but to effectuate an outcome, right? So there's a Seder for Rosh Hashanah, there's a Seder for Passover. You follow the Seder, and therefore you have fulfilled the obligations of Pesach. Sometimes you even talk explicitly about those obligations. As Rabban Gamliel said in the Haggadah, one who has not explained the following three items has not fulfilled his obligation for Passover. You have to explain Pesach, matzah, maror, the sacrificial lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herb. Right? So the things you must do to effectuate an outcome. That is called a liturgy in, if I were in Christian seminary or at HUC, we called it a liturgy. The Jewish word is a Seder, right? Written in book form, a Seder becomes a Sidur. It's the same word. So there's a Seder for the Shabbat table. Seder doesn't mean something long either. There's a Seder for a funeral. There's a Seder for a wedding, right? So next time we gather, we're going to talk more about the Seder for the wedding. We're going to look at what are the actual words that are spoken under the chuppah that effectuate the outcome that we have gathered to create, which is this couple is a married couple. This couple is an authorized new family duly recognized by the Jewish community and congregation. Oh, Joe is showing us something that I did not authorize. Okay. Thank you, Joe. That is unusual. Not sure how to stop that. Okay. So what I would like to do is invite us to, kind of hold today's conversation and pick that up. Right, somebody else. I went to a Yom Ha-Shoah Seder last night. Thank you, Judy. Exactly right. Um, Next week, Rabbi Platkow will be teaching our shiur. I hope you'll come. She is going to kind of do an interlude class where she will share Talmudic stories about actual marriages and relationships in the Babylonian Talmud and what we can learn about Jewish marriage from them. So that'll be really interesting. So it's kind of like halakha adjacent. And I think it will both reinforce, enhance, and elaborate on a number of the points we've already discussed over the last couple of weeks. Why is she teaching and I'm not? Uh, when I originally scheduled the class, I knew that I was receiving an honorary degree from HUC on Thursday, May 1st. And I knew that the event took place at 4 o'clock. So I planned to teach in the morning and then go into the city in the afternoon. I have since learned, even as recently as the last few weeks, that for ordinees from 25 years ago, which is what I am, hard to fathom, but I was ordained 25 years ago this spring. Um, Ordinees, upon their 25th anniversary of ordination, are awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity from HUC. You have to apply for it, but basically, if you didn't die, which is what the joke says the DD stands for, either that or Doctor of Durability, you're given this nice award. At first, I was, for many years, I was kind of dismissive. I'm like, oh, it's the old fogey award. And now, as it's approaching a week from today, I have to say I'm finding it rather meaningful. And I'm especially looking forward to celebrating with a number of my classmates and friends who are flying into New York for the occasion. And my family is coming in, and it should be really nice. And it's for me, it's an all-day affair. It's actually starting at 10 a.m. with a guided tour for for us rabbis of the new building that will become the New York campus of HUC in a couple of years, which is near Lincoln Center. I believe that HUC is in the process or has signed the sale of its current home, which is part of it's near NYU. They're actually selling it to New York University. And I am looking forward to seeing the new building. And then there's a bunch of learning and social and lunch stuff that's happening. And then there's a ceremony at 4 o'clock. You are all invited. You are not obligated. If it scintillates you to see me walk across a stage wearing a black robe and shaking someone's hand, um, I'd be happy to see you there, but I certainly don't expect it. But hey, if you got nothing better to do at 4 o'clock, you do have to register online. So what I will do is when I follow up with Natalie on the recording of today's class, I'll have her send a registration link if you'd like to attend. Um, Meaningfully as well, and you'll be hearing more about this if you're a congregant at WRT, which many of us or most of us are. Um, in connection to this 25th anniversary of my ordination, I and a number of lay leaders from WRT who also are involved with the College Institute have begun an endowment fund at HUC that will support the training of new Reform rabbis, specifically by covering tuition and providing living stipends for all first-year students, which is the year that you spend in Jerusalem. For me, developing the next generation of compelling Reform Jewish clergy leadership, and especially immersing those future leaders in the complexity of life in Israel, is an essential component of rabbinic training. For me, I talked about it on the high holidays this year. That year in Israel was as formative as any other period in my life, but particularly so as a rabbi. I can't imagine what it would mean to become a Reform rabbi without an immersion experience for a year in Israel. It's an expensive year, however. And it used to be the case when I went to Israel, my family basically, and some scholarships from the federal government and my college, Amherst, got me through that year financially, and I took on some debt that I continued to pay off for many years. Many students have a very hard time affording spending a year in Jerusalem. And this endowment will actually allow anyone to attend that year without being burdened financially. So I'm really excited about it. I will be sharing more with you about that in weeks to come too, as well as ways in which you, if you choose, may wish to get involved in that endowment. So, but in the meantime, I'll wish you a Shabbat Shalom tomorrow, continuing our observance of Shoah, which today on the Jewish calendar marks. WRT will hold its annual service of responsibility. I'll have the privilege of being in conversation with 3 generations of the family of Ellen Sunnis, her daughter and son-in-law, Bradley and Lauren Bass, and her granddaughter, Bryn Bass, who's an 8th grader at Scarsdale Middle School. The 4 of them will be narrating the story of the Shoah as happened in their family. Ellen's parents are Shoah survivors, and Bradley's grandmother is also a Shoah survivor. And the thrust of the story is that the 2 grandmother survivors were friends and introduced their grandchildren to each other, who got married and continued the legacy of remembering the Shoah. So it's a harrowing story in terms of course, the trauma of being in the camps. And it is a healing story in terms of the way in which this family is a living example of Jewish survival in the face of genocidal hatred. So I think it's going to be a very moving night, 6:15 tomorrow. And I hope it's a night you'll choose to be with your Jewish community wherever and however you may. So you won't see me online next week, but please come for a great lesson with Rabbi Platkow, and you'll receive more information on all the HUC stuff. Thanks for the extra time this morning for me to share all this with you. Shabbat Shalom. And have a
Shabbat Shalom.
meaningful.
Sandra, I need your email address and telephone number.
All good. I'll send it. Thank you, my friends. Bye.
Bye.